Over the years working as an online coach, I've helped a lot of people lose body fat and keep it off. And no, it wasn't by getting them to do 1,000 sit-ups a day or by wearing a slimming belt during the workouts, but rather by helping them implement specific behaviors into their lives that help them sustain a calorie deficit without always having to feel hungry. So in this video, I want to share 7 tips that you can use to actually lose body fat in a sustainable way, improve your health, and feel more confident about your body. Tip number 1 is to have an inclusive mindset. So in general, most popular diets will place a heavy emphasis on what foods you should not be eating. So depending on who you speak to, that will either be certain foods, like for instance chocolate or fast food, or it can even be certain food groups like carbohydrates and fats. And in most cases, by doing so, you will see a reduction in your total calorie intake, and thus you'll also see a reduction in body fat. However, there are 2 problems with this. The first one is that it's actually not necessary, and as long as you're in a calorie deficit, you are going to be losing body fat regardless of what food you eat. There's actually no such thing as a bad food that will measurably harm you or your goals if it's consumed in the appropriate amount and it fits into your overall nutrition. And in fact, research shows that having this black and white mindset is going to make it less likely that you're going to succeed with your diet and keep the weight off long term. There's actually a study where 2 groups were asked to follow the exact same diet plan, with the only difference being that one group wasn't allowed to eat bread during the diet period. And both groups, as you would expect, lost the same amount of weight and the same amount of body fat. But the only difference was that the group that wasn't allowed to eat any bread was a lot less likely to adhere to the diet, and also 3 times the amount of participants dropped out of the study compared to the group that was allowed to eat bread during the diet period. And the second problem to this approach is that eliminating certain foods and only eating quote-unquote clean foods can lead to micronutrient deficiencies, which can A, result in worse health outcomes long term, and B, also have negative impacts related to your body composition and your training performance. So rather than thinking about what foods you want to be avoiding, you want to be thinking about what foods you want to be including more of in your diet, to make sure that you're feeling satiated and also getting enough of each macro and micronutrient. I really like the concept of the athlete's plate for this. So basically, if you're trying to lose body fat, then you want to make sure that a good chunk of your plate is filled with lean protein. About half of your plate should consist of fruits and vegetables, and then the rest can be some grains like rice, potatoes, or breads. And then you also can add a teaspoon of fat on top of this. Protein will make sure they're able to build or at least maintain your muscle mass during the diet, and also tends to be more satiating than, for instance, carbohydrates and fats. And then fruits and vegetables have a lot of fiber, so they will fill you up, and also contain very little calories, while also making sure that you're getting all the micronutrients that you need. Obviously, you're going to have to modify the portion sizes depending on what size you are, but to be honest, I think this is a pretty good start. Like, most people would probably drop a significant amount of body fat just by following this tip alone, and they wouldn't feel overly restricted, and they would still be able to get all the macro and micronutrients that they need during the day. Tip number 2 is to incorporate calorie borrowing. So this is where you think about your weekly calorie target instead of your daily calorie target. And by taking the 24-hour period off the pedestal, you'll all of a sudden have a lot more flexibility and options in terms of food choices and decisions that you're able to make. So if, for example, your maintenance calories are 2,500 and you want to lose a pound of fat per week, then you would roughly have to be in a 500 calorie deficit. So you could either just eat 2,000 calories every single day, or if you're someone who finds it really easy to stick to the diet during the week, but really struggles on the weekend, what you could do instead is from Monday to Friday, just have 1,800 calories, and that would give you another 1,000 calories that you can spend on the weekend. So you could have 2,500 calories on Saturday and another 2,500 calories on Sunday, and that would get you to the exact same point as if you were eating 2,000 calories every single day. There's obviously extreme ways of doing this that can make this approach suboptimal, and can potentially lead to you developing an unhealthy relationship with food. So I'd still make sure that most days are pretty similar and that you don't borrow more than 20% of your average calorie intake from any given day. But just know that you don't have to be super rigid if you want to reach your goals. Tip number 3 is to eat harder foods. So this relates to the texture of your foods. For example, mashed potato would have a softer texture than baked potato. So if you're eating harder foods, that will mean that you have to take smaller bite sizes. You'll also have to chew your food more, which in turn will result in you eating slower and for longer. And that should affect how satiated you feel during and after a meal. And there's actually research out there to confirm this and show that eating harder foods will lead to you eating less calories compared to if you were eating foods with softer textures. For instance, in one study, the harder condition consumed 33% less calories than the softer condition, which was on average about 500 calories per day. So if you're struggling with hunger and low diet satisfaction, then you might want to have a look at your food choices and see if you're able to make any easy swaps. So for instance, instead of having your whey protein shake after your training, you might want to have something like boiled chicken. Instead of having mashed potato, you could have baked potato. Instead of steaming your vegetables, you could have raw vegetables. And even something like, instead of having a soft piece of fruit like a banana, you could have something a little bit harder, like for instance an apple. Tip number 4 is to make lower calorie food swaps. So having a look at what foods you're eating at the moment and potentially swapping some of those food for lower calorie options is probably the easiest way of you being able to still eat the same quantity of food and still feeling the same level of fullness, while also making sure that you're drastically reducing the calories that you're consuming. So just some easy examples. If you're someone who eats a lot of full-fat dairy, you could just switch to lean dairy instead. So instead of having full-fat Greek yogurt, you would have low-fat Greek yogurt. If you eat a lot of fatty meats, then you would just eat leaner cuts instead, and maybe switch from red meat to white meat, just because that tends to be a little bit leaner on average. Instead of having eggs, you might want to have egg whites. And if you're someone who drinks milk, full-fat milk, then you might just want to switch to something like almond milk instead. Now, this might not seem like a lot, but over time, this definitely will add up. And so just have a look at your current diet at the moment and see if there are any very high-calorie foods that you're currently eating, and see if you can replace them with any low-calorie options. And if you've been enjoying this video so far, then be sure to like this video and subscribe to my channel for more content like this. Tip number 5 is to learn how to track your calories and macros. So tracking your calories and macros has 2 important functions. Number 1, it's a great awareness tool. So much like stepping onto a scale and weighing yourself regularly, tracking your calories and macros will help you develop an awareness of your current eating behaviors. So how much and what type of foods you're currently eating, how much protein, carbs, and fats they consume, and how you feel after you've eaten these foods. And counting calories and macros is essentially a form of self-monitoring, and research has shown that self-monitoring is an important component for long-term fat loss success. And apart from tracking being a great awareness tool, it's also a great feedback tool. So if you're currently not making any progress, then you can use tracking to detect if you're potentially making any big mistakes, and then use that to make any changes to your diet if necessary. So to track your calories, you just simply want to download an app and start tracking everything that you consume. I personally use MyFitnessPal, but there are a ton of different apps out there. Most of them are free. Some of them you have to pay a couple of dollars each month because they have better databases, but even then they're not super expensive. And then you also want to make sure that you buy a digital food scale so that you're able to accurately measure the portion sizes that you're consuming. Because that's probably the biggest mistake that people make when they track. For instance, they'll track that they had 2 tablespoons of peanut butter, when in reality they scooped out the whole jar and it was more like 4 or 5 tablespoons of peanut butter. And that can quickly lead to you consuming way more calories than you actually think. I'd not advise you to track and weigh out everything forever, because obsessive and constant counting of calories is definitely not a very sustainable and healthy approach for most people. But in the short term, I think it's a really good tool to help you get an idea where you're at the moment and also teach you a lot about nutrition. Tip number 6 is to stop drinking your calories. And this is a huge one for a lot of people. So if you're someone who drinks a lot of sugary sodas, then simply switching to diet soda or water can be an absolute game changer. Some other examples would be if you go to coffee shops regularly and have lattes, you could just switch that to black coffee with maybe a dash of almond milk and some sweetener just to make it taste a little bit nicer. Or if you drink a lot of fruit juice, you could replace that with actual fruit, either fresh or frozen, which will also contain some fiber and make sure that you're a little bit more satiated. And then a big one is alcohol consumption. Like, alcoholic beverages contain a lot of calories, and if you're not careful, they can completely erase your calorie deficit altogether. I've seen it time and time again with people that during the week they were pretty good with their diet, and then even on the weekend they weren't too bad with their food, but they would just drink so much that they would completely erase their calorie deficit and they would never make any progress. And then alcohol also has a negative impact on your sleep, which can cause you to feel more hungry the next day, and it can also mess up your training performance. Now, I'm not saying that you can't have a glass of wine in the evening every now and then, or a beer after work, but it's all about finding the right balance. And I've coached a lot of people over the years where simply cutting down on alcohol was the one thing that they needed to actually get the results that they were after. Tip number 7 is to eat foods that are less palatable. So in other words, you want to be eating foods that aren't super tasty. And the concept here is the same as if you're scratching an itch and it comes back 10 times worse in a matter of seconds. The same is true if you're having very delicious foods like burgers and pizza. You'll probably want to be eating that in the next meal or the meal after that, and you'll be craving that a lot more. Whereas if instead you had something like unflavored oatmeal and unflavored chicken or egg whites, then that's not the worst thing in the world, especially if you're dieting and you're really hungry. But it's also not a gourmet meal, and you're probably not going to be craving that after you've finished it. And it's very unlikely that you're going to be overeating on foods like that. If you're still at the beginning of a diet and you're not really hungry, then you don't really have to pay that much attention to this, and you can basically just have nice tasting meals and make sure that you're in a calorie deficit. But the more hungry you get, the more you want to be avoiding very tasty sauces and spices, especially if they're very calorie dense, and instead focus on having foods that are pretty bland but will fill you up and make sure that you're satiated. So as an example, if you're feeling pretty hungry, then having something like grilled chicken breast with maybe some salt and pepper on it, with some green beans and broccoli, and maybe some baked potatoes, is going to get the job done of filling you up and making sure that you're satiated without giving you those cravings that something like, for instance, a nice piece of steak with some French fries would give you. So depending on how lean you're already, you'll want to incorporate a few or maybe even all of these tips into your diet to make sure that you're making the most progress possible. And if you want to learn more about how to measure your fat loss correctly, just go and check out this video right here, where I lay out exactly how you want to go about doing this. So thank you so much for watching everyone, and I'll see you in the next video.